Our next segment, we'll talk about strategies for helping students to learn social studies through text. In our last segment, we talked a little bit about the why, and for the next few moments, we'll be talking about the how. It's important to talk about both why and how so that we can use this information to structure lessons and to structure learning where all of our students are successful. In literacy, when we talk about literacy and social studies, we talk about the application of practices that get to some higher order thinking skills like comprehension, synthesis, and communicating our knowledge that go just beyond a repertoire of facts and dates and moments in time. And we want kids to make big, overarching understandings of systems in social studies and big ideas in social studies. And there isn't just a checklist, if you will, of strategies that are applicable to any learning circumstance. So we want to be able to tailor a set of tools where students and teachers can use the right tool for the right task and navigate through the plethora of complex texts that come into social studies, whether they're reading something from a website or a newspaper or the Declaration of Independence. There are different skills that are necessary in order to make meaning from those tools. You could apply that also to a painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware as easily as you could a music video that you saw on YouTube. Literacy and social studies has a hierarchy of instructional practices. Do we want kids to just have some lower level understanding, or maybe kids don't come to us with any understanding of how to apply literacy skills in social studies content? Then we probably need to spend some time with explicit demonstration of strategies. Most often this occurs in a whole group setting. Sometimes we do that in small group, but for the most part, we do this for all students all at the same time in our class so that we are all on the same page with a common understanding of the expectations and the instructional language that you use. If we want to be able to help students be able to work towards independence or gradually release responsibility to students, we have to offer some opportunities to practice the use of those strategies with our guidance and support. So we facilitate the use of those strategies maybe in writing or in small group conversations where we're kind of listening in and helping them practice and give them guidance to be able to do that. Maybe some structured settings where they do that. But the final goal then would be for students to be able to use what they've learned through our instruction to meaningfully apply those strategies in a wide variety of settings, primarily in social studies class, but ideally also throughout the school day whenever they encounter similar tasks or similar texts that they could remember those strategies and use those on their own. We want to work ourselves out of a job, so to speak, to be able to make sure that kids are independent learners and thinkers and give them lots of practice to be able to do so in any setting. Instructional shifts in the past have very much focused on traditionally finding facts or using textbooks, crossing off all the who, what, why, when, and wheres, and discerning the truth. And there's still relevance to that too, although we try to balance that with more of an inquiry stance and more of an opportunity to get to the heart of the learning of the historical reference or the geography scenario that we're working on as to why and how. Why were those boundaries around Minnesota drawn the way that they were? Not just that they were done at a certain moment in time, but how did that happen and who did that impact? And how can we find that information? Less and less in the 21st century, our references and our learning comes from one source, using a variety of of sources, including digital sources, is becoming more and more prevalent. I know it certainly is in my school district. We encourage multiple perspectives and multiple pieces of information that give us a more complete picture of the topic. And then talking about the cause and effect, or sometimes we call it the impact versus the intent. Did that decision have the impact that it was intended to do? To who and to how, and who did it affect most? And was it in a positive way? Who benefited the least? And then providing arguments. I don't know about you, the listener, but I've worked with students for a wide variety of years and a wide variety of situations, and I've always been able to observe that students are willing to argue. Sometimes they're not always willing to write down their arguments when I asked them to write them down, but promoting different points of view and different perspectives and getting to the nitty-gritty of the who, what, when, and why is more engaging and more relevant for college and career readiness now than it's ever been before. We can ask ourselves a few questions as we're planning for instruction. Working backwards with the end in mind is always a good place to start. So what do we want our kids to be able to know and do? Is it a fact? Is it a big concept? Is it an overarching principle that they will carry with them throughout the whole entire grade level, throughout the whole entire course? Or is it just something that I need them to know today and tomorrow? Will depend on how much time and effort I use gathering texts and teaching vocabulary and determining how students are going to engage in that learning. How will I know if kids have learned what I've asked them to learn? How will I judge success? Is it performance-based task? Is it a group conversation? Is it an assessment that's written? But how will I know that kids have been successful? Is important to consider. And what do I do with kids that already have background knowledge and have already demonstrated their understanding? Is there a way that they can contribute what they've learned along with students that have not yet learned it yet? How would I work with both groups of students? How can I differentiate for both? And how will new information and skills be acquired? What formats am I going to use? What text am I going to use? Do I do it the same way for all of my students? Are all important questions for us to ask. I'm going to give you a few examples of a few key ideas here. After we talk about how will students practice or rehearse making meaning and understanding so that they can do it in multiple circumstances. One way would be to use primary sources. They give us a window to the past. They give us personal perspective about important events that happened in our history. They're not always the easiest to read, and sometimes that can be a detriment or an obstacle for us to how to figure out how to use them in our classroom. We could, again, pair students together that have background knowledge with students that don't. We can pre-teach some of the vocabulary words. We can do some word puzzles and some building background knowledge that just give kids enough zing to get into the text and learn more and make their own ideas about what was important about that period of time and whose voice was being heard, who didn't, and how it impacted the individual people or person that has a special account in the primary resource. Here in this moment in time, we've just had History Day, and I had the pleasure of being a History Day judge, working with some students, judging their History Day products, and primary sources was a requirement of each one of those presentations. And I asked them a lot of questions about how they grappled with finding primary resources and reading them and making sense of them. And they had great tools that I didn't even think of as a teacher, and I thought I had a lot of tools. So I would encourage asking your kids too about what it is that they need to make meaning of the primary sources that you are holding them accountable for. A funny story was that one of the groups that I was judging started out their presentation by saying they were going to talk to me about something that was ancient history, and it was something that happened in the 1970s. So we had a little conversation about ancient history, and ancient not being something that happened in my lifetime. So that was kind of fun. Let's take a closer look at how we might know how kids are making meaning from a primary resource. One way to have students check for understanding when they're working with a primary source, if you can make a photocopy or if you can give it to them on paper, kids can do what we often refer to as marking up the text. They can mark things with a star that might be important. They can mark a question mark next to something they might not understand. They can circle words they don't understand. It gives you a clue as to where to go next with your instruction and what kids might need from you as the instructional leader in the classroom to give them support. If it's not possible to have a paper copy, kids can do this on scratch paper too, and oftentimes they can also do it digitally with a whole wide variety of software applications on their iPad or on their Chromebook to be able to annotate the text too, and include some connections that they're making or comments that they're making that help you know where to go next with letting them grapple with some unfamiliar text, but primary resources or secondary sources that are important for your social studies learning without letting comprehension of the text get in the way. An example of a lesson would be a common theme in our social studies standards about understanding the distribution of power and establishing routines and procedures. Depending on the grade level of the children you are working with, they might be able to read this picture book independently, or it might be something that you want to read to them. But it gives us an opportunity to talk about a big concept in a way that is not only graphically represented, but represented with some powerful language from an amazing author, and gives a context for talking about things that might be a little abstract in terms of laws and how people's beliefs impact the choices they make. It's particularly relevant as we were talking about world dynamics and things that are happening around the globe in terms of the decisions people make based on their belief and who they support. So it's just one example. You can use picture books and graphic text with pretty much any age student. It can also connect it to laws and safety. And that is a common topic we have in school and something that all kids would have a context for to base their learning from and run up that ladder of rigor that we talked about earlier. A great idea for including learning about academic vocabulary in your classroom would be to create a graphic organizer. Kylene Beer's books about adolescent literacy, turning promise into practice, and several of Kylene's other books have great examples of how to do this. The point with this graphic is to remember that a word is not just a word. It's not just about learning the definition, but also what the word represents, what it doesn't represent, and what context it's most meaningful in. The piece of this graphic organizer that I would most highlight is starting with having your students making a prediction about what they think the word is. There's a great body of research to say that prediction is very important to student understanding and to getting from rote learning to higher order thinking. It doesn't really matter how accurate a prediction is. It really just is the act of predicting and making that connection. It's a good window for us to see too what they're thinking in terms of making associations with that word, and it gives us information as teachers to know where to go next in our instruction. Using Native American art is another example of a lesson for you. In the Minnesota Social Studies standards, in every content standard, for every subject area in the state of Minnesota, the contributions of Minnesota American Indian tribes is included. It's a great way to make connections for our different perspective, different points of view, especially for our indigenous population whose narrative is often absent in historical accountings and representations of social studies. And there are great examples of Native American art and great Native American artifacts that could lend to understanding culture, and specifically a culture that most of your students might not have firsthand knowledge about. And then also getting into the big idea of movement and migration. It might not have been a narrative that they heard before, and it's a very authentic way to include the contributions of Native Americans in our teaching. It's also a great way to include poetry. There's lots of Native American poetry. It's a particularly useful tool in social studies because poetry tends to be less text than it would be reading a website or reading a chapter in a book or even reading a picture book, and it also has lots of relevant meaning. Great resources from the Minnesota History Center for teaching with a Native American perspective included in your units of study, so I would encourage you to check that out as well. Regardless if we're teaching about perspective or big ideas, global citizenship, it's a great idea to have a word bank available for students and hold those students accountable in your classroom, accountable for using the words that you've learned in their writing and in their speaking, and make it accessible to students. So if you have a word wall, or even if your students have a portable word wall that they can refer to in conversation or that they can refer to in their writing, the more opportunities kids have to use the vocabulary words and make meaning from them, the better cemented they will be in their learning. We'll summarize by saying there are lots of things that we need our students to be able to know and do by the time they leave our classrooms at the end of the year, or by the time they walk across the stage at graduation. And it includes some of these that are listed here and many more. We're continuing to better understand what it means for all of our students to be college and career ready, and that it's not just a moment in time, but the opportunities are endless for our learners as we prepare for the 22nd century and beyond. And pairing literacy and social studies together is a great start. Thank you.